Okay, why don't we get started? Thank you all for coming. Good evening, and welcome to the students, alumni, faculty, and friends joining us for tonight's China Forum with Dr. Nicholas Lardy. I'm Andrew Murtha, professor and director of the China Studies program in SAIS China. And one of the pleasures of my relatively new role here at SAIS is to host the China Forum. This has been a forum or a platform for presenting the top speakers on China here for the past 35 years. And our speaker tonight is no exception. And he is also no newcomer to this stage. Dr. Nicholas Lardy is recognized as one of America's foremost experts on the Chinese economy. He has been described by the National Journal as, quote, everybody's guru on China, unquote. Currently the Anthony M. Solomon Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, Dr. Lardy joined the Peterson Institute in 2003 from the Brookings Institution, where he was Senior Fellow from 1995 until 2003. Before Brookings, he served at the University of Washington as the director of the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies from 1991 to 1995. Over the years, Dr. Lardy has published many seminal studies of the Chinese economy. His first book, Economic Growth and Distribution in China, was published by Cambridge University Press in 1978. This was followed by Agriculture in China's Modern Economic Development, 1983, Foreign Trade and Economic Reform in China, 1992, and since then, a steady stream of books and articles far too numerous to mention, but not far too numerous for all of you to read. These have helped a generation to understand the phenomenal economic changes taking place in China, from agriculture to exchange rates and banking. Most recently, he published Sustaining China's Economic Growth After the Global Financial Crisis in 2012, and then in 2014, Markets Over Mao, The Rise of Private Business in China. We are very lucky to have Nick Lardy here today with us to discuss his latest book, just out in January, with the provocative title of The State Strikes Back, The End of Economic Reform in China. It is my pleasure to turn the podium over to him now.
Thank you very much, Andy, and thank the China Forum for having me back once again. I think I have been here maybe 3 or 4 times. I don't remember exactly, but I'm happy to talk about my most recent research and the book that just came out, as Andy mentioned. Let me say I was motivated to do this work trying to look at China long-term and answer the question, what is China's potential growth? Will they inevitably slow down as a more advanced, maturing economy? Will there be a financial collapse, or what is their potential growth? And to answer that question, I felt I really had to start by addressing the question, well, what's the cause of China's slowdown over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years? And just to give it away at the beginning, you can see from the title, I think that a major reason for this slowdown is the fact that the state has played a much more active role in resource allocation. More and more resources have been channeled to state companies, and the performance of these companies has steadily declined, particularly vis-a-vis private companies. So that's the kind of motivation. But for those of you who didn't hear my talk here a few years ago about the book that Andy mentioned, the one called Markets Over Mao, I want to review why 5, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, I thought the rise of private business was the major source of China's economic growth, the expansion of employment, and so forth. And these were really kind of the 5 major factors that I looked at. Prices were liberalized, private firms were allowed for the first time, banks and other financial institutions began to lend more money to private companies, more and more investment was undertaken by more efficient private companies, and private companies were able to displace in industry the role of state firms. So let me just run through that quickly. This is just a diagram that shows the extent to which market-oriented prices were involved in the sale of farm products, the sale of retail goods, and in the sale of producer goods. And you can see at the beginning of reform in the late 1970s, virtually all prices were set by the state. A lot of people have forgotten, but there was a state price commission that set these prices. And gradually, through a complicated process that was quite successful, prices were liberalized without leading to huge inflation. And you can see by the mid-90s, 70–80% of all prices were market determined. By around the early part of this century, roughly 90% or more of prices were determined by supply and demand in the market. The lowest curve is producer goods. There were still some producer goods that had price controls. So prices were becoming a signal of scarcity, which they were not in 1978 because the State Price Commission set prices rather arbitrarily. Second major change was legal status for private firms. When China began its economic reform in 1978, there were very, very few private businesses. If you look in the statistical yearbook in the right place, you will find that the authorities believe that in 1978, there were 150,000 people employed in private businesses. Now, if you know the numbers for China, I can tell you 150,000 is almost nothing. It was one-tenth of 1% of the labor force was working in private businesses. In '78, they allowed the establishment of family businesses. They didn't even call them enterprises. And taking a page from Marx, they said you couldn't have more than 7 non-family employees. Otherwise, it would be exploitation of labor. The law that allowed the creation of private enterprises didn't come along until 1988. They revised the Constitution a number of times to increase the status of private firms. And I thought the big breakthrough was when Jiang Zemin in 2001 said private entrepreneurs should be allowed to join the party. So that's kind of the history on the legal status. On the lending, you can see in this diagram, by the early part of the 2010s, more than half of all credit from the banking system was actually flowing to private companies, and only about a third was going to state companies. So their share of lending was quite impressive, and it was one of the things that was fueling the growth of the private sector. And as I'll show you later, the reason banks were willing to lend a lot of money to these private companies is that they were very profitable compared to state companies, and banks were becoming more commercially oriented. As a result of their higher productivity, more retained earnings, ability to borrow, you can see in this 5-year period, the share of overall investment being undertaken by state firms increased very dramatically. And the share undertaken by the state went down. In this period, the growth of, it's not that state investment was shrinking, it was just growing so much more slowly that its share was going down. In this period, private investment grew at 2.6 times the rate of growth of state investment. So that's another indication of the transformation that was underway. Then in the industrial sector, I mentioned displacement. This shows us that most industrial output at the beginning of reform was being produced by state-owned enterprises. Almost all the rest was being produced by collective firms, and some of them were kind of quasi-state, some of them maybe were a little bit private. But the share of output produced by state firms went steadily down till it was only about a quarter of total output by 2011. Not very many state firms were privatized. Very few went out of business. It's just they grew more slowly. Private firms were more dynamic. So this, I think, is a process that's better thought of as displacement rather than privatization. And what happened on the export side? You can see originally, this data series goes back to the mid-90s. State companies produced most of the exports. Their share very steadily declined until, in more recent years, it's down around 10%. Initially, the slack was taken up by foreign firms, foreign invested enterprises. You can see reached a peak of around 2005, and then have been declining. And what really happened was that private firms became more important. Private firms were essentially, as you can see, not involved in international trade. But starting after China joined the WTO and the system was liberalized a bit more, you can see that the solid black line shows that the share of exports being produced by private firms rose steadily. So, of course, foreign invested firms are private, so you could say together, private firms are now producing about 90% of China's exports, about 10% is being produced by state. So all this was evidence that China was increasingly becoming a market economy with market-determined prices, a more efficient allocation of capital through the banking system, and a displacement of slow-growing slow-growing state companies. So this is just kind of a review of what was in Markets Over Mao. And now I'm going to take you to what I'm calling the rollback of market-oriented reform, or the state strikes back. And I'm looking at 3 or 4 kinds of evidence: the change in the flow of bank credit, the change in what firms are dominating investment, a change in which firms are growing more rapidly, and then a phenomenon that I'm describing as anti-competitive mergers. So the earlier period, in the market-oriented growth period, competition was becoming increasingly important. There was a lot of entry of private firms, capital became available to the private sector, and so forth, and markets were competitive, which is very important, because if you want to look at the importance of market-determined prices, you want to make sure that there aren't a lot of oligopolies or monopolies who are able to manipulate the prices to be able to collect substantial rents. So let me just take you through these. You see the red lines are all of a sudden, after 2013, are shooting up. State firms were getting about 1/3 of all the funds from the banking system. By 2016, they're getting over 4/5. And the share of funds from the banking system going to private firms, which had been up close to 60%, 57% at the peak in 2013, was down to around 10 or 11% by 2016. These data come out with a very long lag, so we can't take this past 2016. If you look in the book, I only have the data through 2015, but one more yearbook has been published. These are data published in a book coming out from the Chinese Banking Society, which is in my view, a wholly owned subsidiary of the People's Bank of China. Now, in this period, of course, everyone's aware of the fact that credit was growing very rapidly, but not only did the share of credit going to private firms go down, the absolute amount of loans going to private firms also shrank quite considerably. In 2013, when private firms were getting about 57% of all the loans, they got an increase in their loans. That is, the flow of loans was about 2.6 trillion RMB. In 2016, when they were down to 11%, the increase in the loans that they got was about 600 billion RMB. Well, how did private firms survive in this environment where the banking system was increasingly squeezing them out? And I think the answer is they turned increasingly to shadow banking. So shadow banking became a very, very important, some people like to call this the non-bank financial institutions, but you can use those terms interchangeably. Shadow banking became a very important source of credit for private firms. But in 2017, towards the second half of 2017, the Chinese leadership became convinced, in part because they were being lectured to from the outside quite a bit, that they had built up very substantial risks because credit to GDP had gotten so high and had shot up so rapidly. And so in the last few years, I think we're all aware that Chinese have slowed down the growth of credit quite significantly. And more than that, they have tried to channel more of the credit out of non-bank financial institutions, which are less well regulated and possibly the source of greater risk, and get more of the credit back into the banking system. So I don't have good data, but to show how much credit was going from non-bank financial institutions to private companies, but I think it was quite high. And so there's basically been a twofold problem for private firms since 2013. That is, their share of bank lending went down, and then as the leadership became, I think correctly, more concerned about financial risk and started squeezing the non-bank financial institutions, it had a disproportionately large effect on private firms. This was recognized, and there have been a lot of discussion in the Chinese press, and the regulators have put out some new directives trying to encourage banks to lend more money to private companies, but it remains to be seen whether or not these efforts are going to be successful. So this is the second big discontinuity this is the first big discontinuity with the more reform-oriented period. State companies simply got a much, much larger share of credit after 2013. 2013, that's about the time Xi Jinping came into power. Then, what happened to investment? Well, you won't be surprised if private firms were all of a sudden cut off from credit. Their share of investment, which had been shooting up to 2011, you can see the curve flattens out. And after 2015 or 16, you can probably read the diagram better than I can, the share of investment being undertaken by private firms begins to come down, and state firm investment is shooting up. State companies are displacing private companies in investment, and they're also displacing collective companies. So state investment their share is still below that of private companies, but the marginal change in the flows of, or what kinds of companies are undertaking investment was quite significant. The third is what's happening to the growth in the industrial sector. You can't do the math instantly, but up until around 2015, in the 10-year or 11-year period from 2005 to 2015, on average, private firms were growing twice as fast as state firms. This is consistent with the earlier diagram that showed that the share being produced by state companies in the industrial sector was going down. But something began to change after 2015. The share of the state growth began to pick up, and the private growth continued to slow down. And all of a sudden, in 2017 and 2018, for the first time, state companies are growing more rapidly than private companies. This is absolutely amazing, particularly when you consider that the return on assets of state companies is about a third of that of private companies. I'll show you that in a diagram later. So the least efficient part of the industrial sector in China began to grow more rapidly. And it's consistent with the data on the lending. They got a lot more funds, so they grew much more rapidly. It was very inefficient, but this is a huge discontinuity in the pattern of growth that has occurred since the rollback of the reform, the market-oriented reforms of the earlier period. My hypothesis is that this is mostly because private firms are no longer getting access to the working capital that they need to continue to grow their businesses, so their growth has slowed down dramatically relative to that of state companies. Then the fourth discontinuity, as I mentioned earlier, the earlier period was reflected in more competition, and the period that we're in now, competition is diminishing. And this is particularly true if you look at the universe of SASC companies. This is the State Asset Supervision and Administration Commission, which at the central level was established back in 2003, 2004. They took over the administration of 196 of China's largest conglomerates. Now, 196 doesn't sound like a very big number in China, but these companies have dozens. In fact, some of these companies have more than 100 subsidiaries. So the universe of activity that they control is quite substantial, and it's not limited to the industrial sector, but it includes a lot of service sector companies like the telecommunications companies, electric power, and so power generation, and so forth. Now, the key point is they did some mergers at the beginning, and then they stopped merging activity, and then they kind of resumed it after the middle of 2015. And this is just a list of some of the mergers that took place between the middle of 15 and towards the end of 17. And the key takeaway here is that most of these mergers occur within a particular industry. So if you look, the two travel companies, one that did domestic and one that did international, they merged. The shipping companies merged. The shipbuilding companies merged. The two big rail car companies, CNR and CSR, merged. And market structures, I think, in some of these areas were already fairly concentrated, oligopolistic in nature, and these mergers just created something closer to monopolies. I mean, there's now only one company producing rail cars in China. I think this reduced competition, and as I'll show you in a second, I think it reduced the incentive for innovation and cost control and led to a great deal of inefficiency. And here's the data that shows that. This is SASIC. Well, what's happened to SASIC? First of all, they've massively expanded their assets from around 10 trillion to around 55 trillion. So the assets have gone up by a factor of 5. After all these mergers were completed, they're now down to 90-some companies. That's something like 96 or 94, I can't remember. So the number of firms has been cut in half. The assets has increased 5-fold, so obviously the average assets of these firms is now 10 times larger than it was back just before, a year or two before the global financial crisis. And what happened as their assets expanded? Their productivity went down. Their return on assets, which is simply pre-tax profits divided by their assets, they were running 6-7% before these mergers really got rolling, and now they're down to an average in 15, 16, and 17 of about 2.5%. So their productivity has declined quite substantially. Now, the other takeaway from this diagram is to compare their profits with their assets, or the increase in their assets. And I'll tell you what the math is. If you add up all these pre-tax profit numbers, take off 25% for the corporate income tax, you can overlook the fact that some of these conglomerates have subsidiaries that are listed that sometimes pay dividends. So let's just assume that 75% of all the profits were retained and reinvested. That 75% of the profits would finance about 20% of the increase in assets from the 10, 11 trillion up to the 55 trillion. So as these firms were, so they got 80% of the financing must have come from outside the firm. They got more bank loans, they issued bonds in the domestic bond market. Some of them were issuing shares on the domestic stock exchanges. Some of them that had been listed earlier might have done a secondary offering. So the key point here is that this group of firms had very substantial access to funding outside the firm, even as their productivity was declining dramatically. And I think this is, it's consistent with the earlier diagram that showed the share of lending going to state companies went way up. And this is part of the squeezing out of private firms that was going on in this earlier period. Instead of the money flowing to more productive private firms, it was going increasingly to state firms with declining productivity. Why did this happen? Well, I don't know for sure, but if you read Elizabeth Economy's book on the Third Revolution, she quotes chapter and verse from Xi Jinping's speeches in which he says over and over and over again, state companies must be bigger. Well, their assets have gone up by a factor of 10, so they're a lot bigger than they used to be. He doesn't say they should be bigger and more efficient or more profitable. He just says they should be bigger. So one of the things I try to explore in the book is why did the system move in this direction? Why did Xi Jinping put so much emphasis on state companies being bigger? And I think it boils, well, there are a number of different hypotheses, but I think the most credible one is that he believes that having a big state sector is an important element of political control. And as we know, he has said over and over again, the party must control everything, everywhere, all the time. So there's a spectrum. You could have a smaller state sector that's more efficient, generating higher growth over here, or you could have a larger state sector that's less efficient, generating slower growth, but perhaps giving you more political control. And he's opting for political control, even though he recognizes that he's paying a price. Now, an alternative hypothesis is that he doesn't get it. He doesn't really understand that this emphasis on control has a high economic price. By the way, my estimate of the price is 2% per year. China's growth has been dragged down from roughly 2000, over a 10-year period, 2005 to 2015. Well, instead of talking about it, look at this diagram. This is for the industrial sector where we have the best data, and the top solid black line is the return on assets of private companies, and the bottom line, the dashed line, is the return on assets of state companies. And I think the interesting thing is, in the first half of this diagram, up to around 2005, the productivity as measured by return on assets of state companies was beginning to converge towards that of private companies. They didn't eliminate the differential, but it was huge in the late 90s. It's amazing. This, before the Zhuangji reforms, the average return on assets of state companies was around 1%. There were so many of them were losing money. So what did we have? We had the Zhuangji reforms, which downsized a lot of these inefficient state companies. Some of them were taken over by managers and kind of corporate buyouts. And also we had China's negotiation to enter into the WTO, which started in the mid-90s. And a lot of people are under the misimpression that China started to cut its tariffs after 2001 when it came in. The reality is they had to cut their tariffs as they were negotiating, because all the other members who were in the negotiator, the so-called working party, said to the Chinese, well, we've had multiple rounds of tariff cuts since the 1960s, and you've been, China's tariffs were 60, 70% when they first applied to get in. So they cut and they cut and they cut, and by the time they came in 2001, their tariffs were down to an average of around 10%. So this led, in my view, to a very substantial increase in competition. You could import something for a much lower price than you could have done before. Also, a lot of quotas and licensing requirements were eliminated. So imports were easier to come by. That put a lot of pressure on domestic firms to raise their productivity to compete with the imports. So you had a lot of increase in competition, from roughly, the late 90s through the Zhuangji reforms. And I think state companies responded. They improved their productivity. Now, part of it was the elimination of some of the least efficient ones. After so that by 2007, the gap has been reduced. Since the global financial crisis, you can see that the gap has widened substantially. It's not that private companies were immune to what happened in the global financial crisis. Their productivity declined for a few years, but began to recover by starting in 2016. And if you look at the diagram carefully, you can see that their returns by 2016 were higher than they were in 2007, which I think was the previous peak of productivity of private firms. Whereas state companies kind of went down, 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 and their productivity in 2016 was substantially less than it had been in 2007. So the gap at this point is roughly 3.5 to 1. So if you go back, you think, look at all the assets that are going into this group of companies under SASAC. that has returns that are so low compared to private companies. So that's the basis. Well, it's a little bit more complicated, but the bottom line is that if state companies had been able to grow or be productive at roughly the, continue the productivity growth, not to match the private companies, but to move relative to private companies instead of having this gap open up, they would have grown about perhaps as much as 2 percentage points more rapidly between 2007 and 2015. So I think that's the price that China is paying for the return to state-led growth. And just to remind you, it has several components. One is, and by far the most important, is that the productivity of state companies declined in absolute terms by a rather large amount. Secondly, they got more of the investment resources, so the faster growth that might have been generated if the resources were going to more efficient private companies was lost. So this accounts for about half of the slowdown in China's growth since the global financial crisis. The other half has to do with the external sector. I wrote a lot about this in China's exchange rate policy and so forth, but remember, running up to 2007, China's external surplus was increasing dramatically. It reached, on a current account basis, more than 9% of GDP by 2007. And so net exports of goods and services were expanding up to 2007. That, of course, is an addition to demand. You have consumption demand, you have investment demand, and you have external demand. So external demand was growing rapidly and adding to growth. Since 2007, the external surplus has come down. Last year it was something approaching zero. And so as the external surplus shrank, it was reducing aggregate demand in the domestic economy, and so slowed down economic growth. So if you look, the stylized facts are roughly China was growing at 10, 11%, and now maybe it's growing at 6 or 7%. So the growth has come down by 3 or 4 percentage points. About half of that is because they have successfully rebalanced their growth and are less dependent on running an increasingly large surplus, which is good. And the other half is because state companies have become less efficient and they're absorbing a larger share of investment resources, which I think is not so good. Now, what did I conclude from this about China's long-term potential growth or medium-term potential growth? I'm basically arguing that if China returned to a more market-oriented growth strategy and economic policy, that they could probably grow in the neighborhood of 8% or slightly more for at least another decade. This is a very different view from the view expressed by Larry Summers and his co-author Lance Pritchett. They did a very comprehensive study of all of the countries they could find that had experienced periods of very rapid economic growth. I don't remember, you had to have very rapid growth for at least 6 years, and it had to be more than some threshold. And they found, I can't remember, 50 or 60 episodes where countries had grown fast for a relatively long period of time. They said the most regular statistical pattern that emerged from the evaluation of these countries was that after their rapid growth ended, they grew at 2% per capita. So he said, China will grow at 2% per capita. As he called it convergence to the mean. And as he wrote in his article, I can't tell you when this will happen, I can't tell you why it will happen, but it is going to happen. It is the most important statistical regularity for countries that have experienced a period of very rapid economic growth. And he acknowledged that China had experienced a longer period of more rapid economic growth than all the other 30 or 40 countries that were in the database that they were able to create. My critique of that is that he didn't take into account how poor China was at the beginning. rapid growth in the successful East Asian modernizing countries, whether you're talking about in different years, but in Japan, in Taiwan, in South Korea, began roughly when they were at 25% of the then prevailing US level. So the argument here is, okay, if you're at 25% of the US level, there's a lot of technology you could absorb, a lot of room to converge. Some people, Alexander Gershenkrot in particular, called this the latecomer's advantage. When you begin your industrialization late, there'll be a catch-up process. Well, China's been catching up, but they're only at about 25% of the US level today. And the other East Asian modernizers began at roughly 25% of the US level. They grew rapidly for a couple of decades, not the same decades, but for 2 decades from their starting point. And when they began to slow down, they were at 50 to 60% of the US level. And in the case of Japan, I think it was closer to 70 or 75% of the US level. Well, China's grown more rapidly for a much longer period than any of these other countries, but it's only at 25%. And the reason is they started at 5%, desperately poor, in 1978. When I first went to China in 1978, you would see horse-drawn and mule-drawn carts moving through the city, even in Beijing. And people had rather shabby clothes. There was no vegetables to be had except mounds of baitai piled up on the porches and roof, and absolutely no fruit. There was no internal trade at that time. So I think China's potential growth is something 8% or more, but they can't capture this potential unless they go back to a more market-driven set of economic policies, take away the preference that state companies have. I didn't put up a diagram, but 40% of all state-owned companies consistently, persistently lose money, larger and larger amounts of money, and almost none of them go out of business. And it's because they just keep borrowing more and more money from the banks to stay afloat. So I think this is emblematic of what's been going on in the Chinese economy. They need to get back to a more market-oriented financial system and a more market-oriented system in general. I think if they do, they could grow at, as I say, 8% or maybe slightly more. That's it.
Thank you very much, Nick. I'm going to open up the floor for questions, but before I do, I'm going to exercise my prerogative and ask the first one. So this is, I'm bringing in something that you haven't mentioned yet today, but we hear a lot about Made in China 2025 in terms of a particularly in the talks, in the trade talks between the U.S. and China, and it seems to me that your prescription seems to be somewhat incompatible with the basic parameters of Made in China 2025, and I was just wondering if you could maybe comment on that.
Well, I don't have enough. As you can tell, I'm kind of a data-driven person. I don't tell you what my opinions are unless I have some evidence to support it. And Made in China 2025 is a very ambitious agenda, and the magnitude of resources that's been devoted to supporting it is not easily measured. But I would go back to that diagram on. This is the longest standing Chinese industrial policy to merge all these companies and make them bigger. It has been a catastrophic failure. You're now generating 2 point something instead of 6 or 7 in terms of return on assets. If you multiply 55 trillion by an extra 3 or 4 percentage points and ask how much more value added would you be getting, it would be a huge increase to GDP growth. And I tend to agree with Luo Jiwei, who on the sidelines of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, I think about 2 weeks ago, gave a massive, broad-sided criticism of Made in China 2025. He said it was a recipe for losing even more money, that the government should not be in the business of trying to identify, sectors of the future. It should be left up to the market, and the market should be allocating the resources. I tend to agree with that. Now, that doesn't mean that they couldn't achieve success in some domains. After all, if you're pursuing this broad gauge policy and you have whatever it is, 8 or 10 or 12 areas, artificial intelligence, semiconductors, batteries, et cetera, maybe you'll be successful in one of them, but I think it's likely to be at a very high cost. And you look in particular at semiconductors, which they've been emphasizing for quite some time, at least 5 years, maybe longer. Alex probably knows the details. Nobody thinks they're catching up in production of semiconductors. Huawei had made a bit of a breakthrough in the design of a new chip for one of their products. Can they get it made in China? No. No production facility in China can make it. They outsource the production to TSMC in Taiwan. So I think that's an area where they put in a lot of resources. The goal, obviously, is to cut back on the hundreds of billions of dollars of imports of semiconductors, but I don't think they're catching up. So I'm a skeptic about Made in China 2025, and I'm also more relaxed about it than I think some people are, because I look at this, which is, I say, the longest standing industrial policy, which I don't think has produced very good results. So I think we should be less people that are terrified about China taking over the world because they have this brilliant plan. They think they have this brilliant plan that will be brilliantly executed and everything will be successful. We'll have to wait and see.
Thanks. Okay, why don't we open up the floor? Yeah. And please let us know who you are as well.
I'm just wondering, very good presentation. I'm not an economist, but I learned a lot from your presentation. Thank you. But I think my question relates to, this China's One Belt, One Road initiative, which is to build basically the infrastructure all over the world. It's a global plan. And I'm just wondering this policy of Xi Jinping that, the kind of reducing the share of private sector firms in the economy, how that jibes or goes with these two things, because outside right now is all over the world, whatever the firms are, these are Chinese firms, and they are mostly private firms that are working in infrastructure, whether in Africa or Asia or elsewhere. So I'm just wondering, these two policies, how they go along. Thanks.
Well, it's complicated, and again, I think our information on Belt and Road is somewhat limited. There are all kinds of numbers floating around about what has been spent, what might be spent, and so forth. I think state companies are benefiting from Belt and Road, however. There are 10 huge state engineering and construction corporations that are doing a great deal of the work on most of these Belt and Road infrastructure projects, whether it's rail or roads or ports or electric power generation. Most of the main contracts are to these great big giant state construction and engineering corporations. Now, they probably have a lot of subcontractors, maybe some of those are private, but I think that Belt and Road is probably reinforcing this kind of state direction of the economy in the last 7 or 8 years.
In the back over there?
Stanley Colbert. There is a reason for this that occurs to me, and that is unemployment. That the Chinese authorities are afraid that if in the name of economic efficiency they lay off too many people, they could have social unrest. So they're walking a tightrope between the fear of unemployment, but the recognition that if you overemploy, you're going to have the slower return on investment. So they trying to thread the needle. How does that explanation sound to you?
Well, I agree with your premise that the Chinese government and the Chinese politicians in particular have always been very concerned about social stability, and they have a lot of policies to try to maintain social stability. How important state enterprises are to this effort, I think, is at least debatable. Today, state enterprises, and I'm not just talking about traditional state-owned companies, I'm talking about all the limited liability companies where the state is the controlling or dominant shareholder. They only employ 10% of the workforce, 10%. Now, when Zhu Rongji undertook his big reform of state-owned companies in the late 90s, about 40% of the workforce was employed in state companies. We have different numbers, 30-some million, 35 million people lost their jobs. They had massive programs. Well, they had several programs. If you were near retirement, they allowed you to retire early with no loss of benefits. If you were not near retirement, you could get a severance pay. If you were looking to get back into the labor market, they had job training programs. They had extra unemployment insurance. 35 million people lost their jobs over a course of 2 years. I haven't seen any evidence that social instability increased dramatically. There are only about 45 million people working in state companies today, which is not too much more than the total number of people that lost their jobs 20 years ago. And I'm not saying that all state companies have to go out of existence. I think one of the messages of the second or the third to last diagram is if you increase competitive pressure, there are a lot of state companies that could do better and improve their productivity and compete with private firms. So I'm not suggesting, I'm always a believer that ownership shouldn't really matter. What you should have is competition, and that firms that can compete and survive, it shouldn't really make so much difference if they're state or private. So I'm not suggesting that all state companies have to go out of existence. So I'm not sure how critically important state enterprises are to employment. But certainly much, much less than 20 years ago.
Thanks, Nick. This is a terrific overview you've provided. My question is with regard to the credit going to the private companies. As I understand it, a lot of the credit which is extended by banks and state-owned enterprises is funneled to the private sector and to the small and medium enterprises through the shadow banking system. As much as 9 trillion is now being extended by the shadow banks. And much of it may be going not to the state-owned enterprises, but to others. So my question is, if they are being starved and they are going to the shadow banking system, the shadow banking system is providing an abundance of funding. And a lot of this is coming from the banks because the banks are implicated in the shadow banking system. The state-owned enterprises are implicated in the shadow banking system. They are the ones supporting it. So I don't understand the starvation problem.
Well, if you go back 2 or 3, 4 years ago, lending by banks to non-bank financial institutions, which is this mechanism through which state banks are interconnected to non-bank financial institutions, that kind of lending was growing by 80% per year at the peak. Then it went down to 50, 60%. Last year it contracted by 10%. So the amount of money flowing from the banking system into shadow banking has gone in reverse. And so the ability of the shadow banks to make loans has declined significantly. Remember, assets under management by shadow banks, which had been growing very rapidly in line with the amount of money they're borrowing from the banking system, has gone negative. Assets under management by trust companies, and trust loans, entrusted loans, bankers' acceptances, went down. in 2018. So now I don't know how much of those loans from the shadow banking system were going to the private companies, but I think probably a substantial share, because state companies were getting all this money from the banking system, where they had lower interest rates, and as the banks reduced funding to private companies, the private companies went into the shadow banking system. Let me just give one more kind of more granular detail, if you can stand it, and that is that the share of, first of all, there's a big gap in state companies between those that are run at the central level, which are these companies, and the local ones. These are all central companies. The local companies have a return on assets that's about half of this number. It's about 1 point something. So I think there is a very large concentration of money-losing companies at the local level. How are they being financed? They're being financed partly through shadow banking, but they've also been financed by substantially increased lending by city commercial banks. And these city commercial banks tend to be under the thumb of local political leaders, because typically the city government is the biggest shareholder in most city commercial banks. The share of lending by these banks has tripled over the last decade, and I think they're lending more and more money to local companies to keep them afloat. So they're still getting some money, but I think it's being channeled to money-losing firms that are not able to use the money to expand. They're using the money to pay the interest on the previous loans that they can't finance, to keep their payroll going, but not necessarily to contribute to the dynamic growth of the firms.
We have a question over here.
Hi, my name is Dan Burke. I'm a student here studying China Studies and an intern at CSIS. Two things. One, I thought it was a really interesting point you made about Made in China 2025. If you look at the data, the years when the assets jumped the most and when return on assets also decreased a lot was right in 2015, right when Made in China 2025 was announced. So you may have been onto something there. If I can, I have a bit of a speculative political question, which sounds like may not be your favorite, but given the trade talks right now with Trump and China, do you see that as a possible avenue to put in some sort of reforms that they may be politically unpopular? For example, they can make these changes that may hurt people in the short run but help in the long run, and say, I'm sorry for the pain that's because of the U.S. They can point towards that direction and try to avoid politically harming themselves from any damage that they've done. It's kind of speculative, but something I was curious about.
No, I think it's a good question. I think there are some parallels with the kind of reforms that China had to take in the run-up to being admitted to the WTO. I mean, Zhu Rongji used this external lever to push through a lot of reforms that were, well, not wildly unpopular, I would say, in certain sectors. So I think there's some of that potentially going on now. But I guess my sense is that this is not a linear relationship. It's not that the more we demand, the more they're going to reform. Because I think there is a tipping point. At some point, if the Chinese are asked to do things, up and up and up, more and more and more, that Xi Jinping is going to have to say no. He does not want to be seen as capitulating to foreign pressure. A little bit maybe he can live with, but a massive amount, I think, becomes politically more difficult. So I worry that this argument that pressure is wonderful because it's going to, lead to these kind of strategic reforms. Well, maybe it will, but maybe it'll backfire. The other thing I was point out, there's an irony here. If China did all the things that they're being asked to do, on my calculation, they would grow much faster. And if you think a big growing China is a threat, it's going to be a bigger threat sooner. So this may be a case of, be cautious about what you demand.
Xu Sitao from Deloitte. You have highlight a few period, 2006 to 2011, then 2015 after. I think the key year is really beginning of 2000, and the 3 represents and party membership to entrepreneurs. Do you think Chinese government was being motivated by the fact after Tiananmen Square, so it's important to give people confidence? And do you think in 2015, state sector is striking back because private sector is getting too strong, they demand political voice? So are you trying to say in your book, there is a fundamental clash between this, second generation of leaders versus the new economy, almost like a few hundred years ago in Europe? Is that what you are suggesting?
Well, I'm not sure I fully understand your question, Siddha, but I don't think letting entrepreneurs into the party really was really reduced the party's control. These entrepreneurs, a lot of them became members of the NPC or the CCP, and I think basically the party was co-opting these people, and the people didn't mind because they felt it was giving them more of a voice in policy formulation. Now, whether or not that was true or not, it's hard to judge from the outside. But I don't have the sense that these people were making political demands. I think what they wanted was protection of private property rights, a level playing field, or what Li Keqiang was almost calling in his speech a couple weeks ago, competitive neutrality. I think that's what they were after. They weren't. I don't get the sense that they were campaigning for fundamental political reform. But on the other hand, they certainly didn't want to have party committees forced down their throat in their companies. Peter.
Hi, you know me, Nick Ann Thurston, and I teach here at SAIS. I guess the first thing I want to say is I hope that you can get, this was fabulous. It was just really very, very interesting. And that I hope you could get this, your point of view and your analysis out to a larger audience, beyond economists, because I think the rhetoric in the press now is just so rising China, every day we're supposed to be more and more frightened of China, and you're sort of pulling us back in and saying, look, there's some realities here. And the reality that I'm most interested in, because I've been aware of this for a long time and nobody seems to pay attention to it, is that even though China's GDP as a whole is very high, per person it's still so low. And that means something to me, but it never seems to mean anything to economists. I mean, I've never heard economists talking about that, but you did. So what does it mean to you, and what should it mean for our understanding of China reaching, the Chinese people reaching the sort of same level as the United States? Is that a stupid question?
What does it? I don't think it means very much when China's China's GDP reaches the level of the United States, which may occur on various forecasts. I don't know exactly when. I mean, I say, okay, take the Chinese number and divide by 1.3 or 1.4 billion, and they're at 25% of the U.S. level. That's measured at international, PPP, so-called PPP prices. If you measure at exchange rates, it's even lower as a share of the U.S. So I know for some things, the aggregate amount of output is an important, variable that you want to look at. But for other purposes, you want to adjust for the size of the population.
Okay, so that I understand. But so what does that tell us about the economy and about how China is doing? Does that mean it's really not as sort of prosperous as we think it is, or as the press seems to think it is?
Well, I think you have to differentiate between the pace of change and the level. China's had an enormous improvement in per capita income since 1978, unprecedented, but the level of per capita income is still relatively low. And so it's very hard in common parlance to express any complexity. Everybody just wants to talk about how big China is and how it's going to overtake the United States, which may be an aggregate GDP that might happen in 5 or 10 years, but I don't, for a lot of purposes, it's not very meaningful.
Peter had the microphone snatched out of his hand, metaphorically.
Sorry. Nick, two questions. I'm Peter Botellier. I used to teach here at SAIS. Two questions for you. One concerning the prospects for the private sector in China. But first of all, thank you for your research. You're being true to style, long on factual analysis, short on opinion. Your research incidentally confirms the fear that many China watchers had, namely that the apparent change in party priorities from economic development to control over the economy and everything else would have a significantly depressing effect on economic efficiency and growth. Now, the first question I would like to put to you, are we missing something in looking at the Chinese picture? We all agree with you that there has been that shift in party priorities towards the role of the state in the economy. But if you look at current statements and some indications, it seems that there may be a chance again for the private sector to come back and for the party to change its mind. If you look at the Prime Minister's work report to the MPC a few weeks ago, he mentions that partly as a result of his initiative, that is mass entrepreneurship, no fewer than 18,000 companies register every day, new companies in China. That's 5.5 million companies per year. I don't think we come anywhere close to that in any other country. Surely some of those must be important and successful. We also see a willingness to revise the Foreign Investment Act. And there are other indications that seem to suggest that there is some rethinking going on in the party on the role of the non-state sector. How do you see that? Is there a chance that the Xi Jinping period, with the emphasis on SOEs, will be limited to 5 years? The second point, or is also a question really, concerns the economic rebalancing. I totally agree with what you have to say about it in the first part of your book. You didn't mention it, but this is a success story, enormous importance. Very few journalists are focusing on it. But since 2006, on the Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, that has been, economic rebalancing has been the top priority. The first 6-7 years, they made very little progress, but in the 12th five-year plan, they made significant progress. If anything, you understate that in your book. My question is, given the fact that the economy is rebalancing significantly in the right direction, would that enhance the growth prospects for the longer run and make the comments you made on SOEs less important?
Okay, well, to restate a little bit, the first question is about the prospects for the private sector. I certainly agree with you. There has been a change in tone. It actually predates the NPC by several months. I can't remember over the summer. Remember, Xi Jinping had 1 or 2 meetings with private, well-publicized meetings with private entrepreneurs in which he was basically praising them and saying, you know, you're a very important part of the economic growth, and we want private firms to do well. And that was followed up, you know, with the Chinese bank and insurance regulator put out a number of new regulations that were designed to encourage banks and other financial institutions to lend more money to private companies. There were 3 or 4 regulations that had that objective, and then, of course, we had the speeches at the NPC, which talked a lot about the private sector, and I think reintroduced the phrase that first was heard at the third plenum of the 18th Party Congress, that the market must be the decisive force in the allocation of resources. That reappeared. I didn't go back and check, but I don't remember reading that at the NPC from, 14, 15, 16, and 17, but it's back in there now. So if you just look at the text, it's definitely seems to be moving in the right direction. On the other hand, if you look at some of the high-frequency data on lending, lending to small and micro firms as a share of total lending was still going down in 2018. And as I already mentioned in response to Eswar's question, lending by non-bank financial institutions, which I think goes predominantly to private companies, is also down. So I think it will take some time to kind of redirect things so that the private sector gets better support than it has in recent years. But that's why there's a question mark at the end of my subtitle, and it's open-ended. And I talked about a number of circumstances that could lead Xi Jinping to change his mind about where he wants to be on this trade-off on growth versus control. Now, on the second part of your question about rebalancing, I tend to agree with you. I think rebalancing is very favorable for sustaining economic growth. It means there's, the big underlying cause here is the fact that since 2010, disposable income has been growing more rapidly than GDP. That's because the wage share of GDP is going up. In the United States, the profit share of GDP is still going up and the wage share is going down. And the same is true in many OECD countries. So this is fueling a rise in consumption. It's leading to the growth of the service sector. And I think that is much more sustainable. That relies on the domestic market. You couldn't continue growth based on exports after 2007 because you already had the biggest current account surplus ever of any country on record. And there were increasing objections to that internationally. It was a source of imbalances and so forth. So definitely rebalancing helps. Now, it's a trade-off. The state sector actually has a pretty big role in the private, in the service sector. And there's a lot of restrictions on entry on private firms. The last time I checked, the share of investment being undertaken by the state in the service sector was about 5 times that in manufacturing. So it may be the case, it's not an unambiguous thing because some of the demand in the service sector is falling on less efficient state firms.
In the back there.
Hi, I'm Sean. My wife and I are here just because we're interested in the topic. I'm wondering, so clearly more state control of the companies in China has caused less efficiency in the economy as a whole. Do you feel that the calls for more state control in sectors of the U.S. economy would have the same problematic effects on the country's economy, or do you feel that the USA is in a different place because of having already industrialized so long ago and being a post-industrial power?
Well, let me just say, as I tried to indicate earlier, I'm not against a role for the state. The state has a major role, even in a predominantly market economy, creating a level playing field, making sure that there's competition and so forth, dealing with market failures, controlling the rise of monopolies and other potential distortions in a market economy. So it's not that the state should be fading away, but it should be playing a role that facilitates firms of all types of ownership to compete on an equal basis. Now, I'm not an expert on the U.S. economy. The role of the state in direct economic activity is very low in the United States compared to several countries in Europe, particularly France or Italy. But should it be more? I haven't heard anybody make a very persuasive case, but I'm not an expert on the U.S., so.
Hi, my name is Alex Hammer from the U.S. International Trade Commission and a former SAIS student. I'm going to ask you a little bit about projecting. I know that you're a very data-driven individual. Maybe you can help us think about what's the proper way to think about things. But I take your point about the allocative efficiency problem with the state sector and the decreasing profitability of the state sector. And I think what you're suggesting is that there is an underperforming in GDP because of that. But every indication that we have right now is that there's no sort of going back in this direction. If anything, the Made in China 2025, the Belt and Road Initiative, Xi Jinping's many announcements about the role of the state sector suggest that it's not going to retrench like it was going before. So I guess I'm asking about what do you think are the implications, the practical implications of that? Like, what are the sectors that we should be thinking about? And what do you think is the role of the banking sector in this, in that it's lending more and more to the state sector and being saddled with more and more debt because of it?
Well, I mean, this is one of the always interesting and challenging things about China. There are always conflicting currents and eddies going on that, they're talking about enhancing the role of the private sector, but in other indicators, the state is still being encouraged. And if you try to, well, this is just my opinion, but maybe I don't have the right skills, but if you just look at the rhetoric, I think it's frequently very hard to figure out what the real situation is. So I tend to look at what the actual numbers are on various indicators. So, and of course, part of it is because there's a big internal disagreement about the direction of policy. You have people like Luo Jiwei standing up and criticizing and saying, I think what I've heard from many Chinese economists, that it's what they think. They think that Xi Jinping's emphasis on the state and Made in China 2025 is a gigantic mistake, which is going to cost China quite a bit. But most of them won't, not most of them, almost none of them are willing to, in the current environment where political control is tighter and tighter, they're not willing to come out and say that in public. Now, Luo Jiwei's always been very outspoken. Has been a long-time reformer, a protege, I think, of Zhu Rongji. And when he was Minister of Finance, he was also outspoken, and they finally kicked him out unceremoniously and made him head of the Social Security Administration, which is, shall we say, not exactly a very heavy-duty policy-making body. And he just left that job. And he knew he was going to leave it because it was age-related or it was driven. And so and I'm sure he'll lose his position in the CPPCC, so this was his last chance to give a press conference that would be widely covered. And he didn't miss the opportunity. He spoke exactly what he thought. So it's hard to judge what direction things are actually going in.
Hi, John Holden with McClarty Associates. Nick, many observers discount Chinese statistics on growth. And anecdotally, I was recently in China, heard from a lot of business people, gosh, we're barely growing at all. Certain sectors are negative, a lot of flatlining. There's just a lot of speculation about what those real numbers are. Could you give your gloss on this? You study this more than anybody else.
Okay. Well, with respect to GDP statistics, my advice is ignore everything to the right of the decimal place. When people breathlessly say, well, they've slowed down from 6.6 to 6.5, well, I think, that kind of a change is within the margin of error in their ability to measure. On the other hand, I do not subscribe to the view that they deliberately manipulate the statistics in a way that misleads us. There's a subset of people who think the Chinese economy last year grew at, as you say, flatlining. There was a Chinese economist who said it grew at 2 point something. Well, you have to use a little bit of common sense. You look at the data on Chinese imports last year, and many people have gone back and checked the Chinese import data against what other countries are reporting on exporting to China, and they generally tend to line up. And the Chinese Customs Administration has a long-standing unified body. They only have to measure imports at a handful of ports. It's nothing complicated like measuring GDP. They just are measuring the value. Well, imports grew 15% last year, and to everybody who tells me that China was growing at 2 or 3 or 4%, I say, please come up with a list of all the other countries you can find where imports were growing at 15%, and GDP growth was, in the low single digits. Everywhere, imports are primarily a function of the growth of income. So if your income growth is down to 2 or 3 or 4%, your imports are not going to be growing at 15%. So these extreme commentaries that the growth is grossly overstated, I think are not credible. The other thing I would say, and I said this in my last book, this is all based on official data on pre-tax profits and assets. Well, if the statistical authorities are manipulating everything, why do they consistently make private companies look so much better than state companies? It's on every metric you can find. So, as I say, the data are not perfect, but I don't think they're wildly manipulated. They may be smoothed out a bit. China's GDP growth has much less volatility quarter to quarter than most economies. But, the IMF has looked at this, and their conclusion is when real growth is accelerating, the reported growth is going up, but not quite as rapidly. And when the economy is decelerating, the numbers that they report are decelerating, but not quite as much. So that if you take a long view, the growth of reported GDP probably accurately reflects the real situation.
Hi, Jesse Huang, USTR. I have two questions, actually. It's related to the table you had up before. We had one column for assets and one for returns on assets. If you can go back to that one. So the first one is about assets, which is, could you give us perhaps a flavor as to what the assets are composed of and how sure we are that there aren't, for example, bad assets or non-performing assets? And for example, how do you reconcile that, for example, with a lot of commentary about non-performing loans at state banks? How do you reconcile the two? In other words, are the assets good and the loans are bad, or how do you reconcile that? And is that figure sort of a accurate reflection of the assets? And then number two is with respect to return on assets. Could you speak to perhaps whether this is a short-term trend or a long-term trend in the sense that, for example, if, let's say MIC 2025 or any other industrial policy where if there's a sector and it is developing at the outset, there's going to be a lot of failures. So in other words, what they're not getting quantitatively on financial returns, they may be gaining in terms of experience, and that will perhaps catapult certain sectors to higher returns down the road. So could you speak to, again, number one, the quality and the composition of the assets, and number two, whether the return on assets is adequately capturing sort of the qualitative, experiential returns that sectors may be getting? Thank you.
Right. Well, first of all, with the assets, I should have explained this universe of companies that SASIC oversees are non-financial state companies. They're in some of the sectors that you could see on the names of the mergers. So these assets are not financial assets, they're real assets. Well, there are some intangible assets, but it's mostly the value of plant and equipment, receivables, things like that. And it's measured in depreciated value. So all the assets, they start out evaluating them at the cost of acquisition, and then they depreciate them based on schedules that are set by the Ministry of Finance, certain depreciation rates for structures, certain depreciation rates for machinery, et cetera. So these are supposed to be, for the most part, the depreciated value of real assets. So the question of non-performing loans and things like that. Now, there could be some non-performing things in here. Receivables, for example. Maybe these companies are owed a lot of money by other companies. Maybe the other companies can't pay or won't pay or went bankrupt and they're not going to pay. But there are rules about how quickly they have to write that stuff off. So there should not be a lot of bad debt on the asset balance sheet. On your second question, at least as I understand it, it relates to what I said earlier, and that is in many areas where they have these programs, whether it's Made in China 2025 or these mergers, maybe the gains don't show up right away. And maybe there will be breakthroughs, and all of a sudden some of these companies will be much more successful after they're merged together. And the other thing to keep in mind is, these are aggregate average data. It's about 93 big conglomerates, but if you add up all of the firms, legal persons firms, it's something like 25,000, 30,000 companies. So these averages must disguise a lot of variation. So there are some companies that are doing well. There are certainly also a lot of loss-making companies in this universe that are dragging down their average returns. So I think you really have to drill down and look at individual companies or individual sectors to see what the result of the mergers have been. I'm just looking at it from 35,000 feet saying, hey, this does not look like an unmitigated success. Quite the contrary.
So I think we have.
By the way, I should say, I have shown these data to people from the NDRC who come to visit, because I want to ask them, why do you think this is happening? Well, their first question is, where did you get this data? How did you estimate these numbers? These are all numbers in the SASIC yearbook. It's published Chinese data. And going to John's questions, maybe it's not perfect, but if they're cooking the data, why are they making these companies look so bad? At least I think they look bad.
So we have time for one more question.
Yeah, my name is Zhang Weiguo, and I was here from SAIS and many years ago. I was in Doug Barnett's last class, but been coming to your events every time. I mean, if I can. Well, I've recently had friends visiting. They were talking about private company financing, and there were a lot of liquidity apparently by the banks or local governments, or even as we discussed, MPC was trying to encourage lending there. However, a lot of the private business owners are trying to basically saying, hey, we are ready to die just for a show, to show you what is going on. And there's obviously political concerns about, or the prospect of the economy going back to reforms or more open processes. The prospects are dimming for these people, and that seems to be what is driving their kind of attitude, and saying, I mean, even though you are giving us money, we probably just want to let it go. So given this kind of a sense or a feeling among the entrepreneurs or private businesses, what's your kind of a sense on the prospect of the policy going back or return to reform? Thank you.
Well, on this question of a return to reform, as I said, one obvious possibility is that if growth continues to slow down, Xi Jinping will make different choices. I mean, everybody believes, or at least everybody I know believes, that the legitimacy of the party depends on generating higher living standards, better health care, better education, taking care of the environment, making sure that the vaccines and food are safe, and all those things are easier to accomplish if you're growing at 8% than if you're growing at 5%. So maybe if growth slows down a bit more, he'll make a different choice. That would be one possibility that I talk about in the book. You know, another possibility is that he doesn't get his third term, which he apparently would like to have, at least based on the way he got the Constitution revised. Maybe he will be opposed and not get a third term, and somebody with a more reform orientation will become General Party Secretary and move China more in a reform direction. I don't know. But I think you're right. I think the attitudes of entrepreneurs are very sensitive to the political climate. And that's one of the reasons, why is industrial growth in the private sector slowing down? Well, one possibility is this squeezing out. They can't get the working capital. Another possibility is they don't feel confident in the direction of the economy. They're worried about the protection of property rights. They're worried about the party playing a more intrusive role in their, or potentially more intrusive role in their companies. So maybe they'd rather take more of their money offshore rather than reinvesting. Maybe that's why the private share of investment is going down. It's hard to disaggregate, and you can always find a lot of different anecdotal evidence, but how that adds up in the aggregate is sometimes hard to tell.
Okay. Thank you, Nick, for injecting some badly needed informed moderation into the conversation and into our understanding of China.
Thank you.